It's taken me some time to figure out where to start this story since there are so many starting places, and no end in sight, at least one I can see. So I've decided to start it at the moment that my life changed forever. Not the drastic change that would come later, but a change that began a terrifying journey that has yet to conclude. I'll start the story from when I saw it. A little bit of quick background though. I was born in the early 80s. My parents were youth pastors for a Pentecostal church in the southwest of the US. I had grown up in the Pentecostal church my whole life. Eventually my parents became pastors of their own church, in fact. The start of my story isn't the beginning, but it is the start. I'm going to tell it as I experienced it, so there'll be back and forth from one timeline to another, but I want you to take the same journey that I did. So, I was a preteen when I saw it. I'm not sure about the exact year, but I know that it was between 1995 and 97. It was summer. I was at a church camp, the same one that I'd gone to for most of my childhood. It was in the South US, in the hill country area. It was a pretty large camp, really spread out, and on any given summer, there would be roughly 1,000 campers, including adults who either were counselors, helpers, or those doing the church services. My parents were pretty active with the camp too. In fact, my dad was well known in the district. When people found out that I was his son, they were amazed, sometimes treated me different, like I was first kid or something. I hate saying this, but I would use this to my advantage sometimes and would get away with a lot of things, or go behind the scenes of the camp or any other church activity that others wouldn't. Anyway, my parents were there the summer that I saw it. I was a camper that year. The building where all the campers stayed at was on top of a hill in a large building. Had only been built just a few years prior. The camp was a lot older, but they had added new buildings and such. And after a huge fire at the old cafeteria, which I do have vague memories of, they built an entirely new cafeteria. The building was in 3 parts. The left side held the boys' dormitory, and the right the girls'. The middle was where the small little church sat, and this is where I saw it. The little church had like pink carpeted floors, off-pink walls, and cushioned chairs to match. The kids' preacher was a close friend of my dad, so I knew him pretty well, and vice versa. The stage in the front of the room, which was literally a step up from the floor, had a stained glass window in the back. And I will never forget this stained glass window for as long as I live, and you're about to find out why. It was a picture of a woman in biblical clothes pouring water from a clay jar in a flowing river. For what for, I have no idea. But next to her was a small lamb. They stood on a grassy hill with a tree to the left, I believe, and a greying sky. I had seen it many times before, and I admired it greatly. It was a beautiful piece of work. The room was packed full of kids, all of us ranging from ages 12 to 15, both boys and girls. The boys sat on the left side and girls on the right. There were at least 40 to 50 kids inside here too. Each of us had itineraries, so while we were in the service for an hour, other campers may be doing recreational activities or swimming or any number of things. My bunk, which consisted of about 5 or 6 boys, I think, most of whom were from my church. Being who I was, I usually got to pick who I wanted to bunk with, another perk of being my dad's son. But as the service began, my attention span started wavering. I mean, I'd heard all this religious stuff before from my dad and others. I began looking around, and eventually my eyes wandered over to that stained glass window, and that was when I saw it. It had never been there before, at least not that I had seen. In the lower right-hand corner, near the red stained glass border, was a face. But not just any face, a terrifying face. Aside from everything else on the stained glass window, it looked absolutely real too. Like it was peering through the glass, but that was impossible because behind it was a small area which held lights to backlight it, and there was basically no room for anyone big or small back there. Its skin was fleshly coloured, nothing out of the ordinary, but what really grabbed my attention wasn't its open mouth with what looked like sharp pointy teeth, but its eyes. The eyes were large, bulging out of the sockets. Those eyes have haunted me to this day, and on its forehead were 2 small bumps, like a pair of horns almost, that didn't quite come in yet. It was scary, but I was more fascinated that I'd never noticed it before. I leaned over to one of my friends sitting next to me and asked if he had ever noticed that face in the stained glass window. He looked, but he told me that he couldn't see anything. Confused, I asked another friend who replied with the same answer. It was then that I began wondering if what I was seeing was some sort of optical illusion or something, but why couldn't anyone else see it? The whole time that we were in there too, I just couldn't take my eyes off of it. And when I tried, I felt like it was just staring at me. As we were leaving the room, I walked to the other side to the area the girl sat, and I looked, and there it was, as it was before, this demonic face. In fact, no matter where I was in the room, the face was there. I pushed it to the side, and I spent the rest of the day not thinking about it, until the next day when we went back to the church, and it was still there, same position, same terrifying face, and no one could see it but me. This is when I started getting really scared, and later that day I had tracked my dad down and I asked if I could speak to him in private. We had gone into my parents' cabin. My mother was off somewhere in the camp doing God only knows what, but I asked my dad if he knew anything about the stained glass window in the little church. He told me that he knew enough, and even knew the guy who had made it, and that it cost the district quite a pretty penny. I asked him if there was a demonic face in it, to which he replied, not that he could remember. He asked me why, and I told him that I just kept seeing this face and nobody else could. My dad then got onto his knees, put his hands on my shoulders, and told me not to tell anyone about what I was seeing. I tried to protest, but what I had taken as anger back then was actually fear. What kind of fear? I wouldn't learn till much later. Like I said, I thought that it was anger that a man of my dad's status had a son who was seeing demons in the Pentecostal religion. It wouldn't be perceived well. So, I never mentioned it again to my dad or anyone else, but every single day I saw it. The whole week, in fact, its bulging eyes just looking at me. I didn't know it at the time, but seeing this demonic face was just the start of what was to come. It was the beginning of my journey, but not my parents' journey. So after camp, we had gotten back home, and my parents had hired some youth pastors from out of state, a husband and a wife with 3 kids, 2 girls, and the youngest one a boy. I don't remember too much about the whole family, just a few snippets here and there. I do, however, remember the young boy, only because he didn't look right. Aside from looking like a typical 6-year-old, he was just always pale with dark circles around his eyes, like he was a ghost almost. Which I'm not saying that he was, because obviously he wasn't. But on top of that, the boy was just always sick. Something was just always wrong with him. For the first few months of them being our youth pastors, they had moved into our house temporarily until they could find their own home. They lived in my bedroom, which was upstairs and to the right. I was put in the second living room downstairs, which actually had a TV and a very comfortable sectional couch. The mother actually homeschooled her kids, but never at home. She always took them someplace else. I believe that it was a park or something. Anyway, so while my dad and the youth pastor were at the church doing their godly work, and my brother and I were at school, my mother had the house to herself. She would tell me, too, that she would hear things in the house, and it always came from my bedroom. There were times that she would hear someone stomping in my room, or she would hear voices, or something sounded like it had fallen. But each time that she would investigate, there would be nothing there. In fact, this happened just about every time my mother was home alone, and it had never happened until these people had come and stayed with us. Eventually, they would get a house of their own, but things didn't really change in the house, paranormal-wise, that is. My mother would still hear things coming from my bedroom. There was one incident too where my Meemaw, my mother's mum or grandma, had come to stay with us for a week, and her and my mother saw what looked like someone standing outside the window in my parents' bedroom. They had even called the police, and nothing was really found, except for footprints found outside the window. We had lived in a nice neighbourhood at the time, but the cops had told my mother that, nice or not, there were always peeping Toms. And the only thing that I personally experienced in that house was when I had been sleeping in the downstairs living room, while the youth pastors lived with us and I was watching TV in my parents' room. I even remembered what movie I was watching because, like the demonic face, this has haunted me ever since. I was watching Batman Forever, which at that age was my favourite movie, and I had watched it hundreds of times, I'm sure. I'd been sitting on the floor, leaned up against my parents' large bed. It was night time. The bedroom light was off to give it more of a theatre experience, which I do to this day, I must say. I had both of my hands on the ground. My left hand was somewhat under the bed. I was immersed in the film when, all of a sudden, I felt a hand touch my hand that was under the bed. I knew it was a hand too because I could feel the flesh of it. I bolted up and I just ran into the living room where my parents were, terrified, and I told them. My mother became worried, but my father held his position as a strong man of God and went to investigate. He looked under the bed, checked the closets, the adjoining bathroom, and, as usual, found nothing. To make a long story short, after a few months after they had moved out of our house, my dad had gone to church one Sunday morning. He would always go around 4 a.m. to pray, set up his sermon, stuff like that. And when he got into the parking lot, he had seen the youth pastor's car was in the big empty parking space, as well as another car, one that he recognized but wasn't sure whose it was exactly. When he entered the church, he comes to find out that the youth pastor was with a member of the youth group in his office, having an affair. So, eventually, my father had to fire him, which caused quite a conflict with people in the church, especially the ones who supported the youth pastor, who happened to be related to the girl that he was having an affair with. Yeah, it was very messy. But one woman in particular, though, who I'll call Karen, a Hispanic woman who had grown up in Mexico. Where we had lived, it wasn't too far from, just a few miles from the border, in fact. But there is a reason that I told you a part of this story, because it has a lot to do with the next part. So after the youth pastor and his family were let go, our church, which had a little over 100 people, had begun a revival. My dad called an evangelist friend of his, I'll call him Bob. Bob was married with 2 children, both boys, roughly younger than me, and were more close to my brother's age, I suppose. Bob had begun the revival, which became quite huge, in fact. I should let you know, too, that I'm no longer a Christian, nor do I believe in the Christian religion, and you'll soon find out why. Anyway, this revival became really big, like I said. Our church was filled to the capacity, and people were speaking in tongues and being slain in the spirit and all that stuff. It had lasted 13 weeks, which, now that I think about it, is quite an interesting number, considering things. Karen, who was close to the youth pastor my dad had let go, was giving my parents the cold shoulder and started becoming close with the evangelist Bob and his family. Now one day, during this revival, my mother, whom I'm very close with, told me something that I would never forget. She told me that a woman had come to my father telling him that her daughter was being possessed by a demon and that my dad had to perform an exorcism to no avail. My dad didn't want me to know this, but my mother told me anyways and told me to keep it a secret and not to tell my dad that I knew, or even my brother. One night at revival, as people started showing up and getting ready for service, my mother pointed out the demon-possessed woman to me. She seemed normal, pretty even, and nothing creepy about her in the least. My mother, being the good pastor's wife that she was, always welcomed her, hugging them, talking to them and whatnot. I watched as my mother went over to the demon-possessed woman and welcomed her and then hugged her, and as soon as she did, my mother pulled away as the woman started shaking violently. With a panicked look on my mother's face, she walked over to my father, whispered something in his ear. My dad looked over at the demon-possessed woman. My mother came over to me and told me to get the children rounded up and take them into the dining quarters as she and others cleared out the sanctuary. Once everyone was out, the doors were shut behind. My dad and a few of the board members were behind the closed doors dealing with the demon-possessed woman. It wouldn't be until years later, too, that I found out what had happened behind those closed doors. And it still haunts my father. So, according to what my father told me, he and the board members began praying over the woman who was shaking violently and spouting out obscenities. The janitor lady, Carolyn, was in there as well. And for what reason, I have no idea. But the woman began screaming as if she was in pain. My father continued to pray for her, and not too long after that, the woman began to gag, and at this point, the janitor lady ran to grab a bucket and brought it over, to which the woman vomited into it. My father said too that what came out of her mouth was not normal looking. He said that it was like a blackish blob. His first thought, too, was to take it somewhere to get it analysed, but unfortunately, Carolyn flushed it down the toilet before he could do anything. But what scared my father the most was the fact that this woman was still possessed and told my dad in a dark voice, "We'll meet again." My father doesn't really like talking about this, and I've only heard this story a few times, and when I bring it up, my dad pretty much closes it down straight away. There's a part of me that thinks there's much more to this story, but he won't say, and the reason is that Carolyn never came back to the church. In fact, one day, not too long after, my dad and I had gone to see a movie. Afterwards, my dad wanted to actually go and stop by Carolyn's place to check on her and find out why she hadn't returned. And when she answered the door, she had a cigarette in her mouth, which honestly shocked me at the time. She wouldn't let us in, but she told my dad something along the lines of, "Pastor, what I saw that night shook my faith." And after that, we just never saw her again. Now back to where the demon-possessed girl told my dad that they'd meet again. According to my dad, and even my grandparents have confirmed this story, when he was a young boy in the late 60s, my dad had awoken in the middle of the night and saw a shadow person in his room. As my dad stared at it in horror, he said that it just got bigger and bigger until its head was touching the ceiling. Eventually, my dad found his voice and screamed for my grandparents. That's all I pretty much know about that. Except for one more event. An almost unbelievable event, if I'm being honest. As I stated before, I was born in the early 80s, and not too long after I was born was when my parents were youth pastors at the church in the southwest US, and on a Wednesday night at church, with around 50 to 80 people in the sanctuary, a group of strange people just entered the church. My mother said that there was about 10 or 15, I think, of these people, some of whom were dressed in black leather with spikes, typical 80s punk stuff, while others wore white shirts with anti-Christian messages written in black ink. They had gone to the front of the church during the service and started disrupting it, saying obscenities against Christ and Christians. The pastor and the board members, whom my dad was one as well, took all the people outside the church while somebody called the police, who were on their way. Now, the leader of this group had actually started talking to my dad. The leader was younger than my dad. The leader said that he knew my dad and hadn't seen him in a long time. My dad asked what he meant, to which the leader said something along the lines of, "I was in your bedroom that night." To further prove this, he began telling my dad that he knew a lot about him, like where he was born, who my grandparents were, his social security number, who his best friend growing up was, his favorite teacher, his first car, where he went to college, just everything. Then, the leader gave the same information about my mother. Then, scarily enough, he even mentioned my name, my security number, where I was born, and that I was his, marked, and watched. Just writing this out still gives me chills just considering it. I mean, even if it wasn't a paranormal situation, the fact that these weird people came into our church and knew all this stuff about us, and were so aggressive, it's weird to say the least. I had first heard this story when I was about 16 or so, and I remember one time at camp, the same one where I saw the demon, where me and my friends, who were too young to actually be campers, were heading up to our cabins at the top of the hill, while our parents were doing church camp stuff. It was night time, and on our way up the hill, we encountered a man who just kind of came out of nowhere. He was dressed like a biker, leather and spikes. I don't really remember that much too, except that the three of us friends just got scared and we just ran down the hill where we ran into one of the mothers who told us to get in the van. She looked around with a flashlight as we drove up the hill, but we couldn't see anything. I've always wondered too if this man had something to do with those people many years before who interrupted that church service and said that I was theirs. So now back to the revival. So after the incident with the demon-possessed girl, things got back to normal, in a sense I suppose. On the 13th week of the revival though, Bob had approached my father and told him that God had told him to build another church, and so he did. Except, he took a lot of members from our church, which really did hurt our church a lot. We had roughly 200 members, now down to less than 50, and one of the people who left with Bob was Karen. Karen had come up to my mother and told her that she and her family weren't happy with how things had gone down with the youth pastor. She told my mother that she had come from some dark places in Mexico and that she gave my family the evil eye, which my mother had no idea what that was. And this next part really does devastate me, and just thinking about it honestly brings me to tears. But first I'm going to tell you how I experienced it, followed by what my parents saw, which they wouldn't tell me until I was an adult, and with good reason I might add. So it was a Sunday morning. My mother had awoken me to get ready for church. I got up off of my bed, sleepily, and began to get dressed when I noticed that my dog Pepper had done a crap on the floor. Pepper was my dog. She loved me, and when I left for school, she would sit at the window and just wait for me, but wouldn't even eat until I got home. So panicked, because my mother would get very upset when Pepper would use the restroom on her carpet, I ran into the adjoining bathroom and I grabbed a white towel. I would do the laundry later, but my mother would never find out. I ran over to the spot and noticed that it was actually diarrhea, which was gross and even worse. I put the towel on top and I began to wipe it all up, and that was when I noticed that it wasn't actually diarrhea. It was a big pool of blood. I looked over at Pepper. She was laying next to my bed, and I figured that she was just sick. So at this point, I ran and I told my mum. I thought that she would still be upset, but I saw a terror and just a worry in my mum's face that I'd never seen before. She told me, though, to put Pepper outside with food and water, and we would let her back in once we got back from church. Once church ended and we got back home, I ran out of the car to the backyard. And no joke when I say that I'm still hurt by this and I'm crying. I found my dog lying on her side near the house. I called out to her, and nothing. I called out again, and nothing again. I figured at the time that she was in a deep sleep, so I walked over and put my hand on her to let her know that I was home, and that's when I felt that she was just as stiff as a board. Tears welling in my eyes, I backed away slowly and then ran inside the house to tell my parents. Strangely, too, when I saw them, my mother had tears in her eyes and was really scared, and my dad's face was blank. I told them about Pepper, and that afternoon before church, we took Pepper's tiny body and buried her out in the churchyard, far away from the church itself. It was really hard watching my dad dig that hole and place Pepper in there, now wrapped in a black trash bag, into the ground. And after this, I would descend into some pretty deep depression. Like I said, it wasn't until I was 18 or 19, though, that my parents told me the truth. You see, when we got home from church that dreadful Sunday afternoon, as I ran to the backyard, my parents found the front door slightly open. Upon going inside, my parents were startled to find every picture that my mother had hanging on the walls upside down, also with pictures on tables and all face down. On the kitchen counter, too, was a long, thick strand of hair, which my dad had analysed at the nearby police station and came to find out that it was actually a horsehair, which meant that someone had broken into our house and, even worse, that someone had poisoned my dog. My mother said that Karen had threatened my parents with witchcraft a few days before this, saying that my parents would regret what they had done to the youth pastors. To this day, I really don't understand why the youth pastors were so important to Karen. All I know is that that bitch had something to do with murdering my dog and breaking into my house. Upon further investigation, too, I found out that our family was cursed, and literally, ever since then, my family has been through just hell. I've never seen the demon face again, but I've definitely had many paranormal incidences, most of which I can't find any relation to, but I don't think that this thing has left me alone. My husband, and yes, I'm gay, has seen shadows ever since we got together as well. My husband is actually an atheist and doesn't believe in anything paranormal, but sometimes I think that even he thinks that there's something weird going on. I feel like I'm just being watched, and sometimes I even hear someone call out my name. For instance, one time I was at work and I heard someone call my name, and I walked around the store asking co-workers if they called to me, which they all said no. So, thinking that it was just in my head, I'd gone back to where I had heard it, and my coworker there asked who called my name, which means that she had heard it too. So much has happened in my life, the things I can't even begin to put into writing. I know without a shadow of a doubt that whatever I saw is still haunting me in some form or fashion. Not a day goes by, in fact, that I don't think about that face. Not a day goes by where I don't think about all of this. I don't trust a lot of people, and I don't know if those people have followed me because some incidences make me think that it may be possible. I can tell you, though, that I do live in fear. I don't know how to deal with a lot of this, and my husband, who doesn't think that I'm lying, thinks a lot of this is just in my head on top of coincidence. And honestly, I can see why people would think that. But trust me when I say that this isn't a story that is easy to put into words. It's more something that you just have to experience to understand it. There's just so much more to tell as well, and so much that I could say on this topic, but for now I think that this will be enough. If anyone has any idea of how to fix all this or knows something, any help would be greatly appreciated. Whatever this thing is, whether it's in my head or just paranormal, it's still haunting me and my family too, and this curse or whatever it is, it's getting worse. I'm not lying too when I say that I'm beyond scared. G'day mates, it's Busta here. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you would like to help me out, then please go ahead and watch another video by clicking on a card on the screen. As always guys, thanks for all the love and support, and I'll see you mates in the next one.